Goodbye, Mrs. Moan. 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 Goodbye. Mrs. Moan. Goodbye, 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 Mrs. Moan. Moan. Goodbye. Mrs. Moan. Goodbye, Mrs. Moan. Goodbye, Mrs. Moan. Goodbye, Mrs. Moan. Goodbye, Mrs. Moan. Mrs. Moan. Goodbye, Mrs. Moan.